Welcome to episode 302 of the Postal Hub podcast. I'm Ian Kerr. In this episode, we're going to talk about consumer spending power, the return to in-store shopping, and what all that means for e-commerce parcel volumes. Joining me in a moment to discuss the data behind all of this is Cathy Morrow Roberson from Logistics Trends and Insights. Joining me on the line is, well, she's back, everybody. Cathy Morrow Roberson from Logistics Trends and Insights, the big boss at Logistics Trends and Insights. We were just debating before we hit record as to how I should describe Cathy's position, role. We came with owner, the head kahuna, all kinds of things. The boss, she who must be obeyed, at Leaders in Logistics, Cathy Morrow Roberson. Cathy, it's great to have you back on.
Thank you.
And we're going to get stuck into, well, you like mind a bit of data, do you? We're going to get stuck into a bit of data today, aren't we?
Yeah, a bit.
A bit ominous, everybody, she says, a bit. We want to talk about this idea of consumer spending power, e-commerce, and what it all means for parcel volume. So let's start with the very beginning, Cathy, because it's a very good place to start, as the song goes. What is happening when it comes to consumer spending power right now?
Well, okay, so like everything else in economic data, it depends. It depends on what numbers you're looking at. So last week, I believe we had the U.S. retail sales come out for March, and they declined 1% from February, a month-to-month decline. Well, you have to also keep in mind with those numbers, there's some inflation built in there. So did the sales really decline, or is it attributed to inflation? Because inflation's kind of holding steady around 5%, 5.5%, around that area. So it all depends on how you want to look at it. I personally, looking at just the data itself, which is the unadjusted seasonal data from the Census Bureau, you're actually seeing an increase in retail sales. Again, there's some inflation figures in that as well. So I think, and this is just me being me, that it's not all doom and gloom, because we're still seeing people at the stores. We're still seeing online sales increasing. In fact, let me back up here. In March, the online e-commerce sales did tick up a notch. So they're increasing. So we are, as consumers, we are buying stuff. But you'll find out what we're buying isn't exactly, like the big furniture like we were all scrambling to get back in the pandemic period. We're looking for those sales. So, because there's a lot of sales out there as retailers try to unload their inventories that they acquired last year.
And this is what I wanted to ask you about when you mentioned bargain hunting and things like that. Are we seeing a trade-off between shall we call them essentials and sort of the discretionary spending? Are we seeing any trends there?
Well, food prices have jumped. Okay, so and that's kind of essential, and so we are seeing a bit of the trade-off there as more of our wallets are going more towards grocery items, food items. The fuel has declined over the past few weeks, but it's expected to go back up actually it increased some this past week. So I think we're going to see an increase as we go into the summer months, when we're all going on vacation, that demand gets greater. Plus, if you remember back in early April, OPEC came out and said that they were going to cut production starting in May through the end of this year. So reduced supplies, higher demand equals higher costs. So that's going to weigh those wallets as well.
What about the return to in-store shopping? Have customers been returning to in-store shopping at the expense of online shopping and therefore parcel volumes?
They have. but not at the expense of online shopping. Okay. So remember, okay, going back to the pandemic again, this is when stores shut down because of the pandemic, they shut down for a few months and they started reopening, but limited hours and so on and so forth. They were also investing in that technology. Finally, retailers got a kick in the butt to invest in that online presence. They were doing it before the pandemic, but they were kind of dragging their heels. Now they were like, we got to do this if we want to stay viable. So a lot of investments in connecting those two together, from being able to fulfill in stores to buy online, pick up in store, that whole connectivity there, and the technology investments are still continuing on, by the way, to this day, and they'll keep going. But I think it's that whole omni-channel investments that's helped the retailers. But at the same time, we as consumers are going to the stores, whether we're picking up an online purchase or returning it, or we're going to the stores for those bargains. Because a lot of times, I know around here in the Atlanta area, especially, the stores will have these clearance items, but you won't see them online, but you'll see them in the stores. So, there is that need. And plus, the whole social aspect of going to the stores. A lot of the retailers' earnings transcripts that I've read over the past few months have noted a lot of this return to store trend, but many of them are saying it's normalizing, it's getting back to pre-pandemic levels. So I think we're going to continue to see that, but combined with the online presence.
So the question we're all really wondering now is, what does this mean for parcel volumes? If anything. I mean, you kind of said before, it doesn't mean anything for parcel volumes. Well, does it mean something for parcel volumes?
Yes and no. Okay, so we'll go with that. Or how about it depends?
I was waiting for it depends. Okay, so there we go, everybody. It
Depends.
depends. Cathy Morrow Roberson from Logistics Trends and Insights has been our guest today. No, sorry, Cathy, go on.
Hush. So, yeah, our friends at FedEx and UPS and the post office have been experiencing declines in volumes. I mean, let's see. So, for their most recent quarters, like UPS announced, well, actually, they didn't decline near as much as FedEx did. Their quarters are a little different, as we know. UPS's Q4 volume decline was like 2.3% year over year. That's average daily volumes, whereas FedEx saw over an 11% decline for the period ending the last of February. Those volumes are declining for them as well as the post office. Apologies, I didn't pull the post office volumes, but they're declining too. I think a lot of it, particularly with FedEx and UPS, is that they're looking for that profitable volume. Okay, they're pickier now than they were several years ago when volumes were king and revenue came second. They've realized that they've got to turn profits, and so they're looking for those volumes that can produce the profits, their profits. Their rates, their GRI that was announced back in January, all-time highs, average rate increase of 6.9% for each of them. That's just an average. So if you think about it, the rate increases are really more around 10% for shippers. So, but they're mitigating these volumes declines by increasing those rates. Their average revenue per piece really jumped during these quarters. The data I have, it was a 7.9% during Q4 for UPS, whereas it was an 11% increase for FedEx. So the revenue's increasing while the volumes are declining. But if you look at the regional carriers, our friends such as OnTrack, which is now OnTrack and LaserShip, they've rebranded. they've taken them.
They got married and they took OnTrack's name.
With the regional carriers, it's interesting. They are picking up market share. They're picking up those volumes, according to Pitney Bowes parcel shipping index, which is kind of interesting to see. You notice the regional carriers are expanding beyond their traditional states that they've normally catered to. We've got, like I said, OnTrack going nationwide, except a little swatch in that mid part of the U.S. They're aiming to be national providers to take on UPS and FedEx, whereas the others seem to be more content with the regional focus. But I think that trend towards getting closer to the consumer is really benefiting the regionals more so than the FedExes and the UPSs. And we see a lot of shippers going to them because of that, but also because traditionally the rates have been a little lower than UPS and FedEx. But it's interesting to me because according to the Pitney Bowes index, startups and regional carriers actually doubled their volume in 2021, okay? And then on top of that, the volumes increased an additional 25% last year. But they represent like a little bit compared, UPS and FedEx have the lion's share of the volumes, of course.
I was going to ask, where does Amazon fit into all of this with their volumes? But it's a difficult question to answer because they're not going to report. Typically don't report their or call out their volumes, do they?
No, they don't. But I would put them in between the regionals and FedEx and UPS. I'm still of the mind that their volumes aren't as high as UPS's and FedEx's yet. And it is difficult because they're moving their stuff. Okay, so they're more of a private, like Walmart and Target. However, it's getting murkier because they do have those the aim to become they've never came out and said that they have
opening up
aim.
their logistics network to other e-commerce players to allow others to use their network.
Because they've partnered up with Rite Aid and they're doing deliveries on behalf of Rite Aid in some states. And so they are doing it in certain parts of the country.
Let's take a look at the future then, or try to, I suppose. Let's gaze into Cathy's crystal ball that she keeps there at Logistics Trends and Insights headquarters. What do you think is going to happen next? So when it comes to the delivery world and these trends, in whether it's spending power or e-commerce, and let's just also talk about the actual physical network that's out there, the logistics networks and the fulfillment centers, etc. What do you think might be happening there?
Well, I think right now, here we are, we're just beginning in the second quarter. I think we're almost in a holding pattern that kind of let's wait and see what happens. The inventory levels, they're still high. They're still too high. A lot of retailers are reporting that they're still trying to get rid of these inventories from last year. So until they can get rid of those inventories, and can place orders for replenishment, new stuff, we're going to be in this holding pattern. Manufacturing has been on a decline as well. Consumers aren't demanding stuff. So it's almost like we're all just waiting for this big giant ball to drop. And it could be because we're hesitant. We're waiting to see if we're going to fall into a recession. The jury's still out on that as far as I'm concerned. And also interest rates keep going up. So it's the interest rates are increasing. Whether or not we go into a recession is a big question. We're still got high inflation, from about 5.5% to the goal is supposed to be 2%. That's a long way to go. Inflation shot up pretty fast, but it's slow to go back down. A lot of retailers in their earnings calls reported that they expect a slower first half of this year. Things are supposed to pick up in the second half of the year. I keep thinking it won't pick up until possibly fourth quarter, with the holiday season, if we're lucky. I'm beginning to think we won't see a pickup until next year, early next year, because just things are just slow, slow.
What does that then mean for things like last mile capacity and even automation? Because we've had a lot of talk about last mile capacity when volumes were growing.
hmm
And we've had a lot of talk about automation because of workforce availability. That might not be the right phrase, but I think you all know what I mean.
Yeah.
If you have any data or any clues there as to what might be happening.
Well, it's interesting. Well, with the capacity, last mile capacity, there is an excess of last mile capacity. UPS, FedEx, so many of the other last mile carriers built out that capacity during the pandemic because the thought was, oh my gosh, this demand is going to keep at this level. And guess what? It hasn't. It's dropped. It is returning to pre pandemic levels. So now we're stuck, or they are stuck with this extra capacity. But this extra capacity has also been brought on by automation, automating the facilities. FedEx, if you remember, there was a big brouhaha over this during the pandemic. They were struggling with keeping employees in their facilities. A lot of people catching COVID, a lot of people dropping out of the workforce, so on and so forth. That resulted in a lot of delays in the FedEx ground networks. So they began to invest heavily in automation to help mitigate that loss of work labor. DHL Supply Chain is also automating their facilities, and they're focusing more on those labor intensive type of task that you find in facilities like pick and pack, boxing, loading, and unloading. It's really cool because I toured one of their facilities last month to see some of these the robotics that they've put in place, and it's impressive. In fact, some of the data that they shared with us, this automation or digitization, this is part of their whole digitalization plan. It's estimated it contributes about 33% of total direct hours. And with the collaborative robots assisting in the picking, they estimate that it's increased productivity by 70% and reduced training time periods for people by 80%. So they are seeing a cost savings here. And I think this is the way more and more these warehouses, fulfillment centers, service centers, what have you, they're heading towards. It's this need to improve productivity, but also not to be as reliant on labor as we have in the past, which, by the way, in warehousing, because I was looking this up the other day, warehousing employment here in the U.S. peaked in June of last year. Roughly 2 million people were in that sector. It's now drifted down to about 1.8 million. So it's slowly declining, but still higher than pre-pandemic.
1.8 million people. There are some European countries that don't even have a population of 1.8
No, it's
million
huge. It's
people.
huge. So, what'd be interesting, and I don't have this data, is are these people dropping out or are they being replaced by the automation? Is it the automation or is it the people's choosing to drop out? I
It's
don't
always an
know.
interesting one, isn't it? When you talk about workers in warehouses and the sort of the churn, I suppose you'd call it, especially
Turnover?
if you've got students who are working there to raise money to go to the next semester of school, or people who are just doing it in between jobs. Anyway, I'm going to go down a road.
That's an interesting point because there's been these data points floating around the market for the past year or two that turnover rates in the warehousing space, and this is according to the Census Bureau, no, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it averages around 40 to 43%.
Wow.
Uh-huh. And then I think one logistics provider estimated that it cost $8,500 to replace a worker. Worker.
I was going to say, is that just for one worker, $8,500?
Uh-huh.
That's, that gives you pause for thought, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Cathy, we've covered a lot of territory there, everything from spending power through to replacing people with machines. We didn't really say that. And everybody, long-term listeners will be glad to know that we have avoided our two pet topics, number one being dog attacks and the other being drone delivery. Cathy, we've made it through a whole discussion without mentioning dogs being delivered by drones or anything like that. Anyway, if anybody wants to find out more about Cathy's work, the website is logisticsti.com, and I imagine people can find you on LinkedIn and Twitter and stuff like that, Cathy?
Correct.
So just look up. I'll put a link to Cathy's LinkedIn somewhere. You can find her. Follow her on LinkedIn or on Twitter.
Or both.
Or both. Why not? I mean, it's free. Enough of this.
At least for now.
For now. Enjoy Twitter while it's free. Anyway, we won't go into that. Cathy Morrow Roberson from Logistics Trends and Insights, thank you very much for joining us on the Postal Hub podcast today.
Thank you.
Coming soon on the Postal Hub podcast, Charles Brewer, CEO of POS Malaysia, will join us to talk about postal strategy and some environmental stuff as well. And Snitko from Omnic returns to talk about parcel locker stuff. We've got Johan Peters returning to talk about more urban logistics and sustainability stuff. Stuff is a very versatile word, isn't it? Who knows what I really mean? Dean McCuber from Crossroads Parcel Consulting is returning to talk about UPS. And we've got lots of other great guests coming up soon on the Postal Hub podcast. Make sure you don't miss any of these episodes. Subscribe to the podcast in your favourite podcast platform. That way you'll get it downloaded to that little podcasty thing on your phone or wherever, and you can listen to each episode as it's released each week. Haven't I been good this year, everybody, releasing an episode every single week of the year? How long will I keep it up? That is a big challenge. Anyway, subscribe to the podcast in your favourite podcast platform. Subscribe to my e-newsletter, meaning email, my email newsletter. Go over to thepostalhub.com. You can sign up for my weekly email newsletter, which is the one that comes out with the podcast. If you want to sign up for the Daily Delivery Digest, you can do that there. And the Decarbonising Delivery newsletter, that also can be found on thepostalhub.com. If you want to contact me about anything at all, my email address is ian@thepostalhub.com. Thank you very much for listening. That's not what I say. What do I say? I'm Ian Kerr. Thanks for listening in, and I look forward to your company next time on the Postal Hub podcast. How many times have I done this, everybody? You'd think I'd have it right by now.